So good evening, everyone. So we continue with our sessions here in the series that we call Opening Our Church Buildings in a New Reality. And today we are blessed to have Reverend Canon Zechariah with us. It's a blessing to have him be with us to share his insights, knowledge, and most of all, this beautiful interpretation of this report from the Lake Institute on how that connects with our spiritual life as well. Not only the side of the numbers, but going deeper into that and seeing how that really affects ourselves. So, Reverend Canon Zechariah, welcome to this conversation, and it's a blessing to have you with us.
Thank you, Victor. I'd like to open up with a word of prayer. This prayer is from the Reverend Theodore Parker Ferris, who was a luminary in the Episcopal Church. Let us pray. O God, guide us through the dark places in life. Grant that we may not fear the loss of Thee, knowing that Thou art always by our side, and that life will renew itself in us if we give it time and are willing to wait. And as we rise out of the low places through which we sometimes must walk, help us to be thankful for them, because through them and by them, we may be able to help someone else through the darkness into light. Amen. It is a pleasure to be with all of you today as I set up this PowerPoint. Okay, play from the start. So if I were to give a title to this sort of theological interpretation of the Lake Institute study, which I'll offer the highlights for, it would be this: Exile during the Ice Age. Whether or not it's an ice age is a question, and we'll get into what I mean by that. And it's just a little take on what's happening in light of the pandemic, in light of the national transition situation. Let me offer a little bit about myself. One, I am a friend of Victor Conrado. We were Credo buddies, and I am so grateful to connect with Victor. Your canon to the ordinary, John Paris, is also an old friend and a colleague of mine from the Diocese of Newark. And we had a class or two together at General Theological Seminary. So it is great to connect via the Diocese of New York. But more importantly for me, there are two influences or major loves that I have in life. I am a native of the Diocese of New York. I was brought up at Grace Episcopal Church in Port Jervis, New York, out in Orange County. There are two pictures. One is a picture of the sign, and then there's the side of the church that's up there. And then I'm going to actually pick on Stephen Lee. If Stephen, do you know what that's a picture of right there? The third picture that I have? Does it look familiar? No. Okay. Oh, it's my wife. Sorry. That's actually a picture of Synod Hall. And I'll tell you why Synod Hall has a special place for me. I was brought up both in the Episcopal Church and the Martoma Church. The Martoma Church used to worship at Synod Hall because the Right Reverend Paul Moore consecrated that church in 1980. Because of the ongoing communion relationship. So very much, even though I have not served in the Diocese of New York, the Diocese of New York is still part and parcel of me and my ministry. Today, my project is to correlate the COVID-19 study that the Lake Institute has published, which you can gain access to. If you don't have access to it, let me know. I'll put the material in the chat, and to offer not necessarily a numbers perspective, but more of a theological reflection on the numbers that we received, or the data that we received from the Lake Institute. I have an emerging thesis, and here it is. We are in an ice age, a metaphorical ice age, and are facing exilic realities. Yet we are a people called to bear witness to the resurrection and point towards the reality of a new heaven and a new earth. And I'll get into what I mean by that in a bit. All of you, either by virtue of the song or reading evening prayer or morning prayer, know hopefully the Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is a theological reflection by people who are in exile, who were taken into exile during the Babylonian invasion of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. And when the Babylonians came, we know that the temple was utterly destroyed. It was decimated, and Jerusalem was ransacked. And people were forced into exile. You know, the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego occurs in that sort of exilic period. Psalm 137 is a reflection of these people who are in exile in Babylon, basically missing the fact that they are unable to worship at the temple, which is at the core of their identity as human beings. Let's see. Did it share? COVID-19? Great. So that sort of sets the framework. My thesis, my sort of notion is that as a people, as Episcopalians, as folks, we are so connected to our building. And in many ways, this pandemic has created the scenario wherein we feel as if we are in exile. While we have all these tools to connect us together, like Zoom, Facebook Live, or whatever, or YouTube, whatever sort of platform our churches use, the reality is that we are an incarnational people, and once we're out of our building, we've lost our compass in many ways. We've lost the center of how we worship, of in many ways our identity. And I think we need to understand that. I don't think anyone would say that Zoom, YouTube, Facebook Live, or whatever, if you can do it, is a real substitute for being embodied in our sacred space. And lamenting that is part of this process that we as individuals, as churches, need to go through. Just like the people of Israel, the people of Judah, when they were in exile, lamented the fact that they could not tangibly or embodiedly worship at the temple. Let me say that the Lake Institute has certain findings, and these findings were developed from March through around August, and it was released in September. And I put up some of the bullet points here. According to the bullet points, since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic in March, a slight majority, or 52% of congregations, reported an increase in participation. Over the same time, a plurality of congregations reported a decline in giving. And I just want to put that in some context. I think it would be interesting to track what has happened since September. I don't know about all of you, but I know here at St. Anne's, so let me offer some context here. St. Anne's is a parish of 1,900 folks. Our pre-pandemic, our ASA, our average Sunday attendance was 450. Initially, Our numbers on YouTube, on Facebook Live were very high, but I think that there has been a fatigue since September. So it'd be interesting to sort of take the numbers that the Lake Institute has had that has measured up to September and correlate that with what's happening right now. I highly doubt that 52% of congregations are seeing an increase in participation. It says that congregational giving overall was down 4.4% from March to June 2020, year to year, if you compare it from 2019. And in June, the decline was 6%. Much of it is that if you actually track congregational numbers, giving tends to go down in most congregations over the summer months. So a lot of that was attributed to a decrease in giving over the summer. But let's take that with a grain of salt, because quite honestly, it was only down 6% year to year in a pandemic, which is very interesting. Catholic parishes and small congregations under 50 weekly participants reported declines in participation and giving more often than any other group. So in the Episcopal Church world, the majority of our parishes, I think the median average Sunday attendance is around 54, right, Victor? Yeah. So most of our parishes sort of fall in that demographic where we really need to measure and monitor. In the Lake Institute sample size, 65% of congregations received the PPP program. Catholic parishes and larger congregations were much more likely to apply for PPP funds. Unfortunately, the reality is that many of the larger parishes are staffed significantly, so it was much easier for larger parishes to go through the paperwork, or because of pre-existing institutional relationships with banks, and because of staffing, larger parishes really were able to take advantage of the PPP loan, in contrast with many smaller parishes. And I'd love to hear from you what the trend was later in the Diocese of New York. 14% of all congregations reported reductions, layoffs, or furloughs. 30% of congregations raised funds to support other congregations and nonprofits in need. I think that's something to actually celebrate, that only 14% of congregations reported reductions. Now imagine this. I wonder if these numbers really hold weather to your diocese. Whether the congregations that are in the 50 to 60 range were able to keep full staff, one, and were able to support other organizations like food pantries and other social services, which our congregations truly support in many ways. The next bullet point: while most congregations are planning to move forward without significant budget cuts, not a single congregation expects to increase next year's budget. The majority of congregations hope to maintain their current budgets over the next year. Again, let's read into that a bit more. I think congregations that have resources in terms of endowments and other savings are able to go forward without significant budget cuts because of reserves. But the reality is, I would expect that a lot of congregations that do not have the significant endowments, and we're talking about the more the family-sized parishes that are probably more rural than urban, are probably going to have to make some major decisions here in terms of budgets. this is accelerated by the fact that if we take a look at the declines in our average Sunday attendance, the prospects do not necessarily seem great for the church. The next point is something that I find interesting, and I'll offer some context as to why I feel that this is interesting. Reopening for in-person services appears to be driven more by congregations' political orientation than public health. 71% of conservative congregations plan to reopen by August, while only 20% of liberal congregations had similar plans, and 49% of moderate congregations. At St. Anne's, we are a 30-30-30 parish and 10% other. What I mean by 30-30-30 is this. We have 30% who are who would consider themselves progressives, 30% down the middle, 30% on the right of center perspective, and 10%, I don't know, quite honestly. They're probably all over the map. At the same time, as a parish priest, as a rector, I felt significant pressure to make sure that we were reopening as soon as possible. And we reopened on July the 1st. We reopened, we had significant plans in place. Usually over a weekend, we have 5 Eucharists. We had to cut down the 5 Eucharists to 2 in-person Eucharists and 1 solely live stream. But a lot of the decision making that went behind opening up the churches were kept in mind, one, safety, but also was driven by the fact that we felt that we were in a place where we could open it. And secondly, we saw tourists. So Annapolis is a major tourist center, and we're right in the heart of the city, right next to the governor's mansion. So there's a lot of context in place. There were a lot of visitors who were coming up and down. So there was sort of a social pressure within the congregation to open up. So I want to acknowledge that it's not only political pressure per se, but it's also the social pressure to open up. Okay, next. Do you see this slide? It's Jeremiah's admonition. Great. So in all of this, especially when it comes to the Lake Institute study, what I found interesting was that many of our congregations were able to support other congregations or food pantries or other human social services. And I think it's because as the Christian church, and most of these parishes that were surveyed were either Roman Catholic or mainline denominations, there is an understanding that we are called as Christians to live into the common good. And the common good for us is actually seeking the welfare of the city. Right, directly from the book of Jeremiah, which Richard Hooker for us as Episcopalians or Anglicans really adopted, of wanting to meet human need, even in the midst of our exile situation. So I think it's a matter of pride that we as the church have been able, despite being in exile, despite being away from our buildings, have been able to meet significant human need based on the gospel value, based on our baptismal covenant, based on the common notion of wherever we are, even in the midst of this exile, to seek the welfare of people. Yet at the same time, I ought to say that as people who are living, as a parish priest who's living through this COVID-19 situation, I've tried to grapple with this COVID-19, the Lake Institute study, in terms of our current reality as a nation and as the church. And the sort of similitude that I found was from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. We are in exile. And while Jeremiah talked about, is talking to the exiles who are in Babylon and in Egypt about living into the common good there and seeking the prosperity of the city, as the church, we're in a situation where we know that we are going to come out of this COVID-19 situation, where there's going to be hopefully some vaccines that are developed. But then the task for us becomes, how do we rebuild? How do we rebuild? And I think Ezra and Nehemiah, as it's actually one book, but is canonically divided into two texts, offers some insight about what rebuilding looks like. There are three main characters in Ezra and Nehemiah. There is Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Zerubbabel is someone who is called to bring a group of exiles back and rebuild the temple. And as he rebuilds the temple, he builds the altar, rebuilds the temple. There are people who are complaining in the background, saying, "Well, this does not look like the temple that was destroyed. What are you doing?" He's facing all this opposition. And we see that Zerubbabel is very, very distraught and despondent. I think the reality is, when this pandemic comes back, ceases, when we are able to come back and worship in our church, it's not going to look like what it was before the pandemic. I think we need to acknowledge that. We need to come to terms with that reality, that even with the vaccines that are developed and distributed, we may not see a significant uptick in participation. Ezra and Nehemiah all talk about rebuilding the city walls and rebuilding the moral fabric of society. And it reminds me of the fact that we as a nation are also in a period where we need to rebuild. What value sets will we be able to contribute towards in building and living into the common good? Ezra and Nehemiah face significant and needed opposition in many ways. And yet, I think their lesson teaches us that in any sort of rebuilding effort, what sort of paradigm are we going to offer in rebuilding the church? And in rebuilding our church, what sort of value sets are we going to contribute in building our nation, which is part of our baptismal covenant in many ways? I'd like to suggest that Ezra and Nehemiah were really too insular in their focus. They were only concerned about their particular community and did not look to the wider community. And in contrast with Ezra and Nehemiah, I think I'd like to offer some other imagery from the book of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Malachi, and Zechariah, who talk about the grander vision of salvation, the grander narrative arc of a universal loving God who is not concerned about necessarily a particular group of people, but the salvation of the world. This is what points to the Messianic age through the season of incarnation in Jesus. In the whole narrative arc away from Ezra and Nehemiah and into Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Zechariah, we see that there's a movement from a particular group of people, a movement from ethnocentricity towards a holistic development of people. So let me just do some theological parlays here. As Episcopalians, we are proud of the fact that we have inherited traditions that are valuable, but we need to examine in the rebuilding of the church and the nation, what are the traditions that need to be strictly kept, and what are the traditions that need to be reinterpreted and appropriated. And that's for your congregation to really discern in terms of how you interpret the tradition of the parish in a post-COVID age. Because the reality is, the arc of Scripture points to a more inclusive understanding. We read that the expansion of the Christian community happened when other people joined in the midst of this crisis situation post-resurrection, that people came into the community based on the values of the gospel that were lived out, and a paradigm that pointed towards a new Jerusalem where heaven and earth would become one. So that's the theological commentary. Very briefly, let me just point you towards a study, a paper that was written in March, or actually in April. It's called Leading Beyond the Blizzard. And there are 4 points here, which I think it would be great if you chewed on. Treating COVID-19 as an economic and a cultural blizzard. A blizzard which is the beginning of a little ice age. Remember, we talked about the fact that the possibility is that COVID-19 is forever going to shape how we are as a church. Don't expect the numbers to come back up. Don't expect a return to the status quo, because the status quo has been effectively disrupted. Due to the complex and interconnected nature of our society and economy, again, the underlying assumptions that sustained most organizations are no longer true. It is no longer true that we are going to be able to staff at I'll give you an example. St. Anne's is not going to be able to staff at the levels that we are staffing. We need to do some pivoting. We need to do some creative adjustment in how we as a parish engage worship, engage the world. St. Anne's was founded in 1692, right? 328 years ago. And for a historic parish to pivot takes a lot. However, the pandemic caused us to pivot very quickly. We, as a congregation, did not have the video or the other infrastructure that was needed to stream services. But suddenly on March 8th, through creative adaptations, we were able to stream initially from an iPhone, and then doing the adaptive pivot towards installing cameras and live streaming equipment, to the pivot of creatively now staffing it with people who are dedicated to streaming and titling and doing all those things. It's a luxury that many parishes do not have. I know that because I've been in all sorts of parishes. St. Anne's has had that ability. The reality is, though, next year, I'm going to have to make some staffing decisions about what are priorities here. If I know that a significant portion of my folks are not coming back to church, but are more comfortable streaming, that means that I'd have to make some significant budgetary decisions in terms of how I staff some program areas. The third point, which I find pretty true, the priority of leaders must be to write a new playbook that honors their mission and communities they serve and make most of their organization's assets. Remember, our assets are our people first, financial capital and social capital, leaning on relationship and trust. I think more now than ever is where we actually need to be engaged in the old time phone tree sort of system. If there are parish priests who are out there, regardless of your parish size, calling your parishioners, making sure having that sort of contact that we can do, that pastoral sensibility, and empowering lay leaders. Like we have a group of 35 Stevens ministers who can't do Stevens ministry necessarily in the traditional way of Stevens ministries, but who are doing the phone bank system of calling parishioners every week to make sure that things are okay, and if there are any sacramental issues or issues that priests need to know about, that we know about right away. If you take a look at any sort of leadership material, the whole notion of strategic planning has gone out the window in many ways. It used to be that we would be able to develop a 10-year plan or a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan. But right now, with technological eruption and disruption, and with these sort of global inlays and scenarios, it's very hard to do any sort of strategic planning. So it's up to us to sort of really, as congregations, to discern how the Spirit is leading us moment to moment in the grander scheme of things. And I know there should be questions about that, because it's a question that I have. How are we going to do this? I think the creative, as Andy Couch says, the creative potential for hope and vision is unparalleled right now. Well, paradoxically, this creativity will only be fully available to us if we also make space for grief and lament. Folks, the reality is this is not an ideal situation. We would not wish this upon anyone, any generation of the world. So take this time to actually to grieve, to lament. And this is where, as a parish priest, I can share some. I don't know how many priests are on board, but to vestry folks, make sure that your clergy get some rest, because this sort of adaptive pivot has been psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually draining. And because we have been on the front lines of trying to keep the church alive, running, thriving in the midst of this, we have not had the time to effectively grieve, to lament the situation that we're in. So in many ways, COVID-19 was the perfect storm, with national upheaval and continued uncertainty. I think we need to come to terms and grieve that. In the Diocese of New York, you're blessed with immense spiritual resources, immense spiritual communities out in West Park, out in on the island of Manhattan, of spiritual communities of prayer. Finding ways to tap into them online, offering your grief, I think, is important. So some takeaways based on that. One, to all of you, lay ordained, have compassion on yourself and your ministry. We're all doing the best we can. We're all doing the best we can with the finite resources that we have. Expect funding to go down in some cases, remain static in the majority, and increase in our rare few. post September, I've heard that there are some congregations that are seeing an increase in giving. I know date at St. Anne's right now, the number of returned pledges have gone down by 5%, but our giving has gone up by 35%, which is an odd phenomenon. But it also suggests that there are a lot of people who are able to plug in and are generous with the stewardship of their treasure in this time. We are all in exile, whether you want to call it an ice age or exile. We are in this situation. So just take time to re-envision and be creative, living into the Anglican ethos of working towards the common good. The church is changing. It has been changing. The ASA numbers and the whole missional movement in the past 10 years of discussion have shown that. But I think COVID-19 is only accelerating those changes. So which leads us to think, during this time of COVID-19, we need to be thinking about different models for funding our churches and different membership models of leveraging our assets in different ways. Before COVID-19, for instance, we were thinking about leveraging some of our real estate assets in terms of renting out space and things like that. And COVID-19 totally disrupted that sort of real estate model. So what does that look like in your situation? What does funding and or sort of how does creative funding occur? That's a discussion that I think parishes need to have. We will rebuild because this is God's church. Yet, let me remind you that even the rebuilding process is temporary. The temple that Zerubbabel built was ultimately destroyed as well. All temples are temporary. The narrative arc that we have is the building of the new Jerusalem, when heaven and earth will become one, the vision of the book of Revelation. Yet in this liminal period, in this temporary period, the question to ask is, what are the new membership paradigms that we have to engage in, given our tradition? How do we remain the Episcopal Church? How do we remain churches in the Diocese of New York that is loyal to the tradition, but appropriates that tradition in meaningful ways without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Finally, let me encourage us that as we build this new church, this sort of stopgap approach before there is a new heaven and new earth that we read about in Revelation. We are, as Archbishop William Temple said, the church is the sign and symbol of that reality, of that community, of people who are called to live into the common good. How do we point towards that Easter hope, the hope of resurrection? How do we point towards the hope that there will be a new heaven and a new earth?